Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Bible study. We are in Mark chapter 12 this morning, studying Tuesday of the Passion Week. Now, you'll remember in our last video, Jesus has just finished telling a story about some terrible tenants, and at the end of the story, he compared those tenants to the religious leaders of his day. They had killed God's servants, the prophets, and now that they have the Son of God in their hands, they're seeking to kill him too. And it's true, they do want Jesus dead, but their hands are tied at this point because the crowds can't get enough of Jesus Christ. They love every word that he says, and the leaders know that if they try and harm Jesus in any way, well, then the crowds are going to turn on them and their lives would be put in danger. So they have to take a bit of a different approach at this point, and instead of trying to attack Jesus, they ask him some difficult questions in front of large crowds seeking to trip him up. In our text this morning, we find two of those questions, one about taxes and the other about the resurrection. So let's go ahead and take a look at this first question, starting in Mark chapter 12, verse 13. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. Now, who were the Pharisees and who were the Herodians? Well, the Pharisees were a religious group of men who were extremely well versed in the Old Testament. They had most of it memorized, and they were the ones to go to if you had any question about what the Old Testament says or how to apply it to your own life. Now, the Herodians were a little bit different. They were a political organization, and they just wanted to keep the Herodian dynasty in place. King Herod and his kids have been reigning inside the borders of Israel under Roman authority, and the Herodians just wanted to keep the status quo. So they joined forces and they asked Jesus a question. Look at verse 14. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God." Now, this is complete hypocrisy. They don't care about Jesus at all. In fact, they're trying to have him killed. But here's their question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? Now, in their minds, this was an impossible question to answer. You see, the common man hated the Roman government because Rome loved to show its authority by imposing all kinds of taxes on the Israelites. There were poll taxes and property taxes and income taxes. Everywhere you turned, Rome was taking your money, and they were using your money to support their armies who were keeping you under oppression. So the commoners hated the Roman tax. And the Pharisees and the Herodians believed that if Jesus said, yes, you should pay taxes to Rome, then the commoners would turn on him. However, if Jesus said, no, don't pay taxes to Rome, well, all they had to do was call Pontius Pilate and tell him, we got a king here who's saying not to pay taxes to Rome. Can you come and deal with this guy? And the Roman government would take care of Jesus without the religious leaders having to lift a finger. So they think that they've got Jesus trapped here. How is he going to respond? Should they pay taxes or should they withhold taxes? Take a look at verse 15. But knowing their hypocrisy, Jesus said to them, why are you putting me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. Now, a denarius was a silver Roman coin. On the front side, it had a picture of Caesar, and on the back, there was an inscription about him. For example, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. So they bring him this coin, and Jesus asks them, whose picture is this? And they said, well, it's Caesar's. And so Jesus says, well, then give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and give to God the things that belong to God. You see, Jesus escapes their trap by making this important point. You don't have to choose between serving God or serving your local human government. They actually go hand in hand. The way that you serve God's kingdom is by behaving as a good citizen in the Roman Empire. So yes, obey the Roman government, but at the same time, make sure that you're living as a good citizen of God's kingdom. So what does this mean for us in 21st century America? Well, number one, it means Christians ought to pay their taxes. We should get out there and vote. We should participate in the government as much as we are able or comfortable participating. And yes, during this time of quarantine, we should obey the government's instruction to stay safe at home and attend virtual church on Sunday mornings. Now, that's not to say that we always must obey everything that the government says. We are commanded to obey God first of all. But whenever the government instructs us to do something that doesn't contradict God's word, we live as good citizens in the kingdoms which God has placed us in. Now, the people respond to this by just being completely amazed. They marvel at the wisdom of his words, and they devote themselves to obeying God by living as good citizens in Rome. That brings us to our second question. This time it comes from a group of people called the Sadducees. Now, they were another religious organization, and they were sort of the enemies of the Pharisees. You see, the Sadducees were wealthy and corrupt. They were the ones in charge of the temple. They didn't get along well with common Israelites. In fact, they rejected most of the Old Testament. They only believed that the book of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy, was inspired by God. They rejected everything that was supernatural, such as angels and demons, heaven and hell. And so they bring to Jesus a question about the resurrection. In verse 18, the Sadducees came to him, who say there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses wrote to us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but leaves no child, then the man must take up the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." That's absolutely true. In Deuteronomy 25:5, God gives Israel a command called the levirate marriage. Now, here's how that worked. If a man marries a woman and he dies before the woman has an heir, then the man's brother is obligated to his sister-in-law to give her the heir that she needs. So the Sadducees invent this incredible scenario based on the levirate marriage. They say this in verse 20. So there were 7 brothers, and the first took a wife, and when he died, he left no offspring. And the second brother took her, and he died, leaving no offspring, and the third likewise, and the 7 left no offspring. Last of all, the woman also died. And they follow up this crazy story with this question. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? For the 7 had her as a wife. Now, the Sadducees must have been thinking, we finally got him. There's absolutely no way that he can answer this question without looking completely ridiculous. I mean, who'd ever heard of 7 brothers sharing one wife? But look at how Jesus responds in verse 24. Jesus said to them, "Is this not the reason that you are wrong? Because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God? For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are they given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." Jesus points out that the failure of the Sadducees was due to their lack of understanding about God himself. They didn't understand God's word, and they certainly didn't understand God's power. Jesus explained that the marriage relationship would be totally transformed in heaven, and that those who were bound to each other in the covenant bond of marriage on earth would be released from that bond in the new heaven and the new earth. Then, for good measure, Jesus teaches the Sadducees another lesson about the resurrection from the Torah. Verse 26 says, "As for the dead being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the burning bush, how God spoke to him, saying, 'I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob'? God is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. So you are quite wrong." Now, Jesus' argument here from Exodus hinges on the author's use of the present tense of the verb to be. It's not that God was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their death did not mean the end of their existence. They're still existing in God's presence, making him currently their God in heaven. So what does this teach us about the kingdom? It teaches us to study God's word, because in God's word we find everything that he wants us to know about the past, the present, and the future, and how to live our lives according to God's power. These two questions and Jesus' answer show us the brilliance of Jesus as he deals with his adversaries, escaping the danger of their questions and turning them around to teach us about his eternal kingdom. I hope that you enjoyed this study this morning. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below or you can email me. I hope you have a great day. God bless.